my dears, I mentioned the concept of this video in a recent video just like as an idea, and I heard you all loud and clear in the comments saying you wanted it. I am here for the people, so here we go. Today we're going to talk about how languages are changing around the world to accommodate gender neutrality and even just the concept of gender in general. Also, while researching for this, I posted on my Instagram story saying like, does anybody speak a language other than English and how does your language cope with non-binary folks? Send me a message about your language. I got over 100 DMs with all of you telling me about your languages, and everybody was so nerdy and so excited to share, and it brought me so much joy. So thank you for your help in researching for this. Also, I did not realize how much of my following is Swedish. Like, it's a lot of you. I got so many messages about non-gendered pronouns in Swedish. Also, if you're new here, hi, my name is Sydney. My pronouns are they, them. I am a queer, disabled, autistic, trans, non-binary actor, composer, educator, media analyst, access reviewer person. I should just start saying multi-hyphenate and leave it at that, but yeah, that's what I do. I talk about anything related to looking at the world more critically on this channel in the realm of whatever particular topic interests me at the time. Usually it's disability related, but not always. And if you want to stick around, you are welcome to. Also, video description for friends who need it. I'm a white young person with light brown shoulder length curly hair wearing a shark button-up t-shirt. It's like navy blue. It's like medium blue and then it has navy blue sharks on it because I am an adult. And I'm sitting in front of a wall with green leaves on it. Also, if you hear any loud banging noises throughout this video, there is an elephant dance party going on upstairs. Alternatively, they're remodeling that apartment. I don't know, but I need to film this today. So we're just gonna roll with it. It's gonna be so great. This is the New York City experience. We're feeling all New Yorker-y. It's so good. Okay, so before we can talk about non-gendered language, we need to talk about linguistic gender and why it matters more than we think it does. Also, some linguists use gender within its original meaning, linked with like genre, to describe different categories or classes of words within language, which made researching for this video very difficult. I am referring to a sexed gender here, not a gender equaling class. To explain that another way, if that explanation made no sense, because it probably didn't, when researching gendered language, I learned about languages that had nouns and verb agreements divided up as either masculine and feminine, and also about languages that had nouns and verb agreements divided up either as animate or inanimate or with other kinds of classes and, you know, qualifiers, because the word gender used to simply mean type and not be related to sex or expression at all. That is fairly recent in the English language. Most, if not all, languages have gender, but a large percentage of languages do not have sex-related or sex-based gender. I'm going to refer to it as linguistic gender for this video because there are a lot of social connotations inherent to the gendering of language, and also because I don't want to say the word sex 100 times in this video because I would have to censor it in the captions, which is a pain. But if you see other articles or linguists are referring to it differently, that is why. That's what's going on here. Also, articles rarely specified which kind of gender they were referring to with their data, which was really unhelpful and made nailing down solid facts for this video a lot more difficult than I expected it to be. But anyway, there are three categories of language in regards to gender. The first is grammatical gender, being languages where all of their nouns have gender. So like French, for example, where croissant is masculine, but an apple, une pomme, is feminine. The gender is just the way that nouns are categorized. People don't really think about them as being inherently gendered when they, you know, think about an apple being a man or a woman. Like, they don't usually process it that way. The second type is natural gender. These are languages where nouns are usually not classified by gender unless they are people related. Like in English, a croissant and an apple are both just things, but a waiter and a waitress are inherently gendered. Both of these gendered language categories fall under the grammatical gendered language category that makes up about 40% of the world's languages. The third type is genderless. These are languages that don't have inherent gender with their nouns, they just kind of are. Finnish is an example of a genderless language, as are many Native American language families. Sometimes small gender pieces will creep in a little bit to genderless language, particularly as languages are picking up pieces and terms from other languages with increased globalization. But also, like, most people that messaged me about genderless languages said, we're genderless, but we don't have a word that's not gendered for aunt and uncle. So like, there's just like a couple things that exist within those languages, but majorly they're not noun gendered at all. Genderless languages make up about 60% of the world's languages. Now, the way that language is constructed affects how we see the world. This makes sense. One story I heard in one of my psych classes about this was about how the Inuit language has several different words for snow, therefore they have a better conception of different kinds of snow than English speakers do, because we only have one word for snow, to talk about like the cognitive relationship to language. I looked up this story to make sure that it was factually correct because a lot of things I heard in my psych classes were not factually correct, and it's not, so good thing I looked it up. In English, we just group more words together to describe different kinds of snow rather than having separate words, and therefore we can conceptualize the same concepts, we just phrase them differently. Much like we have light blue and dark blue, while other languages have distinct words for them as different colors. It's really hard to measure the cognitive impact of how much that understanding of language actually has in a person, and also the whole like Worfian debate of how language shapes culture and thought versus the debate that culture shapes language, which shapes thought, is a messy one that everybody's been arguing about for centuries. But one thing that is more measurable is spatial reasoning. Is a great example of this. A famous example being the difference between how time is conceptualized in Mandarin versus in English. When English speakers talk about the passage of time, we tend to talk about it horizontally, like a road out before us and behind us, and Mandarin speakers tend to talk about time vertically. And in a 2010 study at Stanford, they found that when doing time-related spatial tasks, even when not related to language, English speakers stuck to the horizontal and Mandarin speakers stuck to the vertical. Bilingual speakers were more likely to stick to the associated language structure they were being tested in and switched back and forth when the language switched back and forth. I also found another study from 2017 where Spanish speakers were more likely to see time as size and quantity rather than length. So like this is a thing that we can measure. And there's a lot of other evidence as to how language affects cognition as well when we look into sexism. A French study in 2015 found that when using the masculine forms as default for professions, which is the norm in French, we'll get to that later, participants were more likely to only name men who were successful in that field and were less likely to associate women as being successful in that profession. When they used both words, participants were more likely to name and judge them equally. After the study was completed in 2015, the group that did it suggested to the Académie Française that things needed to change in the language because it is perpetuating sexist ideals and mindsets, and the response was, no, if we start listing both of them, people will get confused. Which is awesome, and a theme that will come up throughout this video. We also have specific connotations between different supposedly equally gendered words, such as prince and princess, or master and mistress, with the feminine version of words often having a more sexual, dirty, lesser connotation than the masculine. In general, countries with gendered languages as their primary language are more likely to report worse labor market participation rates for women and more aggressive gender norms, according to the World Bank in 2019. Even on a smaller scale, I talk a lot about this on this channel, about how having the language for things helps us to conceptualize them more clearly. I always felt weird in my body, and then one day I met a non-binary person who told me what gender dysphoria was, and that led me to put my own pieces together and finally be able to describe my experience in a way that made sense to me and felt a lot more happy and a lot more me and became able to accommodate my needs. The language that we use matters and impacts how we see the world. And specifically with gender, being able to break out of the binary creates a whole lot more freedom in identity and understanding of the world. Once you start to deconstruct your idea of binary gender and gender in general, you start to see a lot more things differently. Which is why it's important to make sure that when we're using pronouns such as they, them for non-binary people, you're not looking at them as like, oh, that's a girl who uses they, them pronouns. But as a non-binary person who uses they, them pronouns, if that makes any sense. You know, like there's the element between using the language and understanding the language. But anyway, what I'm trying to say is that language affects how we see the world. The way that we use and conceptualize language that we have affects how we see the world. And a lot of the way that language changes is alongside to how the world is changing so that our language can accommodate the experiences of the world that we currently live in. And sometimes those changes feel really clunky and really weird at first, but then they settle into the language and you don't really think about it anymore. Like the way that gender and sex now have two different meanings, but 75 years ago, they both just meant type. Language changes all the time. The reason that gender changes feel particularly, I guess, pointed is a word I'm gonna go with here, is because they are linguistic changes that are fundamentally trying to change norms and trying to include queer people into the conversation. And we are all used to the like, oh, kids these days, so there's weird no words I don't understand, blah, blah, blah. Like, we're used to that. But this is effectively that. It's just, it feels a lot more threatening to a lot of people because of the fact that for some reason, people find trans people to be scary just because we don't conform to outdated societal norms. Almost like having non-conforming people makes people harder to categorize and control. Wild. It's also a really great way for people to say they feel uncomfortable around trans people because they're afraid of messing up the language around us and not because they are just transphobic. I do say that with a caveat, it is genuinely difficult to change one's language. We're going to talk about that a little bit down the line. But there are people who do not want to put in that work and then use that as an excuse to hate on trans people, to not acknowledge that they just don't like trans people. But anyway, Moving on, what I found most interesting about this is that in a lot of these languages, it's not just the queer community trying to change language to be inclusive of all kinds of people. There are also a ton of cis women who are trying to change the languages to be less patriarchal, because that also has negative impacts on the outcomes and livelihoods of minority people. And so much of the proposed change and the in-progress change comes from linguistics nerds, from people who love their native language and want to be able to express their identity within it to show their peers that their identity isn't something imported from another culture, but one that exists within the world they're already in. And it's so cool and nerdy, and it makes me want to cry. I love people so much, but let's talk about linguistic change. I'm going to start with English and then kind of make my way around the globe, sort of, with the languages I found information for. Pretty much every article I read about this spoke solely about English, Spanish, French, German, and Swedish. A handful mentioned Mandarin and Tagalog, but this conversation's really, really Eurocentric. And some articles that mentioned other languages like Russian, Hebrew, and Japanese were all like, but these cultures hate gay people, so they actually don't use any of the linguistic changes because they don't care, so that's why there's not a lot of data, which is racist and also wrong. I found that across the board, most languages, regardless of laws on sexuality and trans rights, are at about the same spot when it comes to linguistic change. A couple are a couple years ahead and a couple are a couple years behind, but generally everybody's in the same general area. And I generally like to fact check everything I find in 3 different places before I put it into a video for you. For this video, it was find it in 3 different places or have a native speaker tell me about it, preferably more than one. So for that reason, my linguistic discussion is going to still end up being more on the Eurocentric side. Also, a large chunk of Asian lingual groups are genderless languages anyway, so that's also part of why. Anyway, so English. This was the one I found most information on, for obvious reasons. Also, one of my followers sent me a podcast episode titled The Grammar of Singular They from Lingthusiasm, a podcast that's enthusiastic about linguistics. It was incredible. It was nerdy. I loved it. I highly recommend checking it out. It's linked in the description. What I learned is that English used to have gendered nouns, much like French or German. English is technically a mishmash of earlier forms of those 2 languages anyway, but that's a conversation for another day. But in the 1200s or so, we generally lost gendered nouns. Also in the 16 and 1700s, the word you became the informal singular, replacing thee and thou. Think of you as formally being the English equivalent of the French vous and thee and thou being tu. Also, just a little bit of Quaker history to throw the Quakers in here. We love adding some Quakers in here. Quakers believe that all people are equal, and so we therefore would refer to people, all people, regardless of formality or status or anything else, using the informal thee and thou, and we're seen as incredibly rude for doing so. And today, many Quakers still keep with this tradition and continue using thee, even though we dropped the thou somewhere historically, which I think is really interesting. But thee still exists within Quaker conversations, and today it feels absurdly formal in comparison to you, when it used to be the other way around, which I think is really, really interesting. But I go to meeting every week, and some Quakers in my meetings still use thee, and I kind of love it. It's so great. Anyway, back to language. So the thee to you language shift happened about 300 years after the singular use of they started to be used in the English language, with its first appearance in writing appearing in 1375. So next time somebody tells you the singular they is not grammatically correct, feel free to tell them that it has been in the English language since before we stopped saying thee and thou. They won't like it, but you can definitely say it. The singular they, of course, is not just specifically to describe a non-binary person, but also to describe a person whose gender you don't know, such as like, oh, somebody left their wallet over there, or something similar. An interesting concept that came up in the podcast that I've definitely felt but never thought about before or had the language for before is the distal they, i.e. that using they as a pronoun for someone seems to imply that you are distanced from them or you don't know them that well, kind of like the difference between calling somebody Mrs. Wilson or Myrtle. I've read too much Gatsby the last 2 weeks. I'm so sorry. I don't know why my brain gave me those names immediately. We will see this idea come up in other languages as well, where people use the linguistic non-gendered formal case to refer to non-binary people, which also implies some level of distance or hierarchy. I would expect that over time, as it becomes more ingrained into the language and normalized, that hierarchy or distance will diminish, but also it has technically been around since 1350, so who knows, but it's also being used in a slightly different way now than it is back then. In that then it was meant to be more vague, and now it is a lot less vague and also used more frequently, so I do expect things to change linguistically, but we're gonna see. That's the fun thing about linguistics. We have no idea. Another gender shift we have in English is defaulting to the masculine or using the masculine term as the default, such as referring to everyone as an actor or a waiter rather than actor, actress, and waiter, waitress, or getting rid of it altogether, such as firefighter instead of fireman, or dear audience instead of ladies and gentlemen, though all of these still have the same issues that we saw with the study about French that we just talked about, of defaulting to the masculine does inherently harm the feminine folks in that field. The other thing that I found interesting in the podcast was that they discussed the ability to accept and use linguistic changes. Studies have found that in general, older people have a harder time accepting and using singular they, while people who are trans or have trans friends or are younger are better with it. And that people who are more inclined towards benevolent sexism, i.e. there are fundamental differences between the binary genders, have a harder time with the singular they. And that it does take work for everybody to learn it, but most people who put in that effort to make it more naturally a part of their language do so because they want to make other people feel happier and safer, and they are able to figure it out. Many people do genuinely struggle with adjusting to these linguistic changes, but with enough practice, the vast majority are able at some point to use it semi-easily. Most of which I feel like we knew implicitly, but hearing it spelled out with data behind it is still really interesting. But that's how English is handling gender, with a general default towards masculine where needed, but also the creation of neopronouns and of neutrally gendered words, and the deliberate expansion of the use of an already existing pronoun. Next, we have American Sign Language. I talked about this in the history of the ASL video. That's what got us to here. You can watch that video up here if you want, but ASL does not have gendered pronouns anyway. It does, however, have certain gendered terms such as mom and dad and sister, brother, etc., with the feminine ones being located in the bottom third of the face in reference to strings of a sunbonnet, and the masculine ones being located in the top third of the face in reference to a baseball cap. And words like parents are signing mom and dad in a row. Siblings is similar. So the neutral that has been created and is being used more widely is using the cheek. So rather than parents looking like this, it would rather look like this, and rather than brother or sister, it would be sibling. I don't know how majorly widespread this is within the community, but the fact that it is being talked about and written about extensively seems to me that it is somewhat normalized. The thing with ASL is that it's a fairly new language, and given its history has been forced to evolve in a lot of ways, and also easily molds to accommodate different kinds of disabilities and access needs. I also know there's some conversation about it becoming a more one-handed language, with people holding phones in one hand on video call and signing with the other hand, so it does feel like it fluidly handles change really well, and I'm sure this is adapting pretty nicely, but I also have not been in primarily deaf environments in quite some time, so I could just be making all of that up. If any deaf folks are watching, please let me know in the comments. I would love to hear about this one a little bit more from outside of linguists talking about it. I have not heard actual people talking about it. Staying on this continent, in regards to indigenous languages of the Americas, I was not able to find a ton of concrete information, primarily because, first of all, these languages are genderless and that their words for parent and sibling are neutral anyway. Their nouns tend to be classed by animacy instead of gender. There are a lot of discussions specifically within the Two-Spirit community about reclaiming identity within their native language, and how picking a neutral pronoun in English feels silly when their language already understands their identity more fluidly. But a lot of linguistic understandings of indigenous languages are few and far between because white supremacy, and that's it, actually. That's the only thing. Next language is Swedish. I don't know why these two are back to back with each other. Let's not worry about it. Swedish pronouns are han and hon, so they created hen as a neutral in-between pronoun that was added to their official dictionary in 2015. Also, I googled how to pronounce everything. I'm gonna put all the words on the screen anyway in case I horribly butcher things, because I am liable to do that. And if any of the editing in this video feels choppy, it's because I forgot how to pronounce things and had to look it up really quickly again before saying it again. Sorry. Every article I read about Swedish said that hen is almost universally used, and then a lot of the people who messaged me who speak Swedish said that most people don't use hen because it feels weird, and they use den, which directly means it, but they don't see it as meaning it, instead of using hen, which made me really question the validity of literally everything else I read, because every single article talked about how Sweden is really, really great and everybody loves the pronoun hen. So I don't know. Anyway, generally they created a neopronoun that worked as a solid in between. People were really mad about it at first. They added it to the dictionary. Over time, studies are showing that very few people are mad about it at this point as it becomes natural in the language. So good on you, Sweden. In Finland, they have the pronoun han, which is neutral and has been used for centuries, but native speakers find that to be absurdly formal, so they just refer to everyone, regardless of gender, with se, which directly translates to it, but nobody really sees it that way. Just like with Swedish. They do not have a neutral form of aunt or uncle though, and that is something that several people messaged me about being annoyed with. Norway is very similar to Sweden. Their new neutral pronoun is hen, which they added to their dictionary in 2022. Would assume that the lack of neutral aunt uncle still exists in this language. I had so many people message me about this for the majority of languages. pretty much from every linguistic group, so I'm going to assume it carries across between linguistic groups. In Iceland, they have combined the two binary pronouns into the new pronoun han. I don't know how common that is, but I had 3 people all message me about it, and I found it in an article, so it must exist somehow. Also in Icelandic, the words for occupations are almost always grammatically masculine, to the point where they're not really seen as being male-oriented. There used to be feminine words for a handful of female occupations, like nurse, but they have been replaced with the grammatically masculine words in the 20th and 21st centuries. Generally, the Icelandic language has 3 grammatical genders, like German does, with those being masculine, feminine, and neuter, but they seem to have the ones in reference to people pretty much neutralized at this point. In Dutch, they have a hen pronoun as well. Some people are using die, which is an old-timey pronoun not really used in the language anymore that's being repurposed. Some people just smush the 2 gendered endings together to create neutral ending, and that has been the default thing that people are using in Dutch. Scottish Gaelic has the pronoun iat, which is similar to the singular they, and has been in their language for a long time as well, very similar to how English developed our they. Welsh has a gender neutral pronoun and possessive pronoun, but then the sound of the following word changes based on the gender intended by the neutral pronoun. The article I read was basically just a queer Welsh person saying they wanted to make things better and here's how the language works now, without a lot of info on how they're changing it. It seems like they just switch back and forth between the 2 genders when speaking, which we will also see in other languages down the line. That's a pretty common solution. Also, some professions in Welsh have a gender neutral ending, so they're trying to repurpose that ending and put it onto other words to make them neutralized. Then we have French, which is a mess, and I say that lovingly as a French speaker. Basically hey, we need to change our language to be gender inclusive, we have data about why that's a problem thing has been going on since the feminist movements of the 60s, because women did not like that everything defaults male. More recently, they created a neutral pronoun combining the masculine il and the feminine elle to create iel. I could not find any examples of what kinds of verb and noun agreements one would use to go along with that to make it grammatically correct, but it exists. There's also an increasing trend of including all the possible endings in order of masculine, feminine, and plural when listing things, so as to include all the options and not privilege the masculine as the norm. This is being done in several different ways, using hyphens, middle dots, periods, capital letters, and parentheses were also a thing for a while. The parentheses are starting to become less common because they're seen as more clunky and also give the connotation that the identities in parentheses, often the feminine one, are lesser than. The other solution is just mentioning both, so people are saying like tout et tous rather than just the masculine tous to refer to everybody. French has a thing called the Académie Française, which is basically in charge of deciding what grammar and words are allowed in the language and what are not. They have banned the use of all gender neutral and inclusive language that we just mentioned from being in any official documents, despite it being recommended by the State Equality Commission in 2015. Great! In general, these norms are changing faster in Canada, Belgium, and Switzerland than they are in France. In Italian, it feels like the conversation is even smaller than in France, though it does seem more common in the central and southern regions. A citizen-led project titled Italiano Inclusivo suggested the use of a schwa as a neutral vowel. The schwa is written in IPA as the symbol of an upside-down E and is the sound, like you would hear in balloon or family. But anyway, the proposal was shot down by the Accademia della Crusca, the Italian version of the Académie Française. Generally, the schwa is sort of catching on, kind of, so instead of like amica and amico, it would be amica, but it's really hard to tell the difference with a lot of words between and When I was abroad, we were told that young folks were using u because, like the letter u, because that sound isn't really used in that language, so we said amicu, or we just dropped off the ending altogether, saying amic and bambin to not gender it at all, which we were regularly glared at for and definitely yelled at by our Italian teachers for, but it was effective, and I did learn from real Italians that it is also a thing that Italian young folks are doing. The other option is combining the masculine and feminine endings to create a new ending, such as attorice instead of attore and attrice. Online, Italians usually just replace the vowel with a star or the at symbol, and they use the plural they, loro as pronoun, but generally this language tends to be more online than an actual conversation based on my experience and the handful of folks who messaged me. Next we have German, which is already notorious for being a gendered mess, with Mädchen, the word for girl, being in the neuter case, not the feminine. The pronoun of choice seems to be the neopronoun de deren in reference to the English they them, or capital S Z, which is the non-gendered formal case. Then there's the whole gender star situation. In 2019, Hanover became the first state capital to mandate the use of gender neutral language in all official communication, from emails to brochures and posters. It deployed what's known as the gender star, an asterisk placed within a noun to indicate it refers to men, women, and non-binary people alike. For instance, the word for all citizens became BürgerInnen. This is very similar to what French proposed with the hyphens. It also originated from the 1960s feminist movement, though it has been moving faster of late, and while this is mandated in Hannover, the Gesellschaft für Deutsche Sprache, the Association for German Language, has refused to acknowledge that this is a thing. Yay! Spanish is the language with the most actual change of the romances, using the ending of the letter E rather than the letter O or the letter A, and has created the pronoun ella as a combination of the masculine and feminine, though this pronoun is not officially sanctioned. The Real Academia Española is not a fan. Hopefully you're starting to see a pattern here. Before the E ending was created, the solution was to use the at symbol or the letter X where the gendered letter was, but since that's wholly unpronounceable and also very anglicized, they are switching over to the E. The strongest shift of this is happening in Argentina, but it is slowly spreading to other Spanish speakers around the world. Catalan uses Eli and Elis as a sort of combination of its gendered pronouns, and the local government has been advocating for linguistic change for decades along the lines with German and French ideals. They are trying to use the existing neutral or alternatives for professions. Be sure to mention both gendered professions or default to the feminine instead, which I think is an interesting take. What if we did that? What if we just defaulted to feminine so everybody is an actress and everybody is a waitress? Because that would fix the gender binary thing in that you would think about it not as masculine default. It's fascinating. I think it's so interesting as an idea. I haven't seen it anywhere else, but I think it's so cool. Anyway, all of this has been printed up by the Autonomous University of Barcelona as formal recommendations for Catalan speakers, which I think is really cool. I don't know how much they're actually being used, but they have been formally acknowledged, which is rare. Portuguese and Brazilian Portuguese are effectively doing the same thing as Spanish is doing with the E and the combination pronouns. Romanian has been defaulting to the unpronounceable X as a neutral ending and have created a neo-pronoun combining the masculine and the feminine, though it's interesting about Romanian specifically is that this language has kept the neuter gender from Latin. I believe it's the only Romance to do that, which you would think would help here, but their neuter is expressed via the things being masculine when singular and feminine when plural. I don't know if non-binary speakers use that convention for themselves or not. I think it would be very difficult because you're usually referring to yourself in the singular, so it would stay masculine exclusively, but who knows? I think that's really interesting. Hungarian and Estonian are genderless languages, though I did get a message from an Estonian speaker about how they do not have a neutral word for uncle and aunt or sibling, so I think most gender languages have this problem just based on the data that I've gathered, but who knows? Next is Russian, which has both the gendered case and the animacy case, which I think is so cool and shows so much about how this language was created. In a lot of spaces, Russians are repurposing the neuter word anoa, which is used for non-living things, kind of like it, but with a little bit more connotation if I understand it correctly. Their usage of the word is generally seen as reclamatory, taking back the neuter case that already existed within the language. In regards to agreeing nouns and verbs and adjectives to that pronoun, they tend to flip back and forth between the two genders. There's also the option of using the plural form they in their language, but that is how people used to refer to actual royalty, and so it's not really used by the queer community. All I could find about Polish is that gender comes up a lot more in the past tense than it does in the present, so a lot of people reword things to use non-gendered conjugations where they can, and that some people are combining the two gendered endings with an underscore between them to create a more neutral ending, but that was all I found for that one. Hebrew is, I think, my favorite of all of these languages because there's the non-binary Hebrew project, which basically built a third gender within the language based on examples of gender expansiveness within Jewish traditional texts. And they have a whole website with a whole guide, and it's just so cool. I've linked it below, so you should definitely check it out. But in general, Hebrew speakers tend to stack the masculine and feminine cases, like we've seen with other languages, sometimes adding a period in between to be more inclusive, sometimes not. Many others just interchange the masculine and feminine back and forth. I had somebody specifically say, we tend to interchange them, but people get so confused so easily that it almost isn't worth it, because it's not like split pronouns where you can sort of wrap your head around it. It's like full verb conjugation changes that normally denote different people when we change it up within conversation. The Academy of the Hebrew Language considers none of this legitimate. We've seen that before. Arabic has masculine as the plural default, much like French does. The solution for most folks is to just interchange pronouns ending at agreement. Modern Standard Arabic has a neutral they and you like pronoun that used to exist that some folks are reclaiming, but apparently it sounds absurdly formal, so a lot of people really hate it. Some Tunisian dialects of Arabic use the feminine pronoun for everyone, and it's therefore becoming neutral, so there is linguistic speculation that this may spread and it may turn out to be a neutral pronoun for Arabic. Persian and Farsi are genderless and use the animacy case instead. I would assume the uncle and aunt situation carries across here as well. In Hindi, personal pronouns are neutral, but the verbs are conjugated in the binary. There's a sort of they-them neutral honorific situation used for elders and other people worthy of formal honorifics that younger queer folks are co-opting, but I was told that nobody likes it and it sounds really formal and it doesn't work, so I don't think it's actually being used that much. Tagalog has neutral pronouns, as is Indonesian, yay for them. Mandarin uses the same word for he or she, pronounced ta, but but they are written as different characters. Some people will add an X in front of it or spell out ta in the Roman alphabet. That solution is obviously not ideal because it's not within its own language. But what is interesting is that the gendered characters actually appeared in the 19th century along with increased contact with Western language. Otherwise, grammatical language isn't really found in Mandarin or its wider language family, so that was kind of all I found for this one. Japanese is interesting because they also do not have grammatical gender in the sense of conjugations and noun editing, so it's technically a genderless language. But there is a sort of binary vocabulary and grammar, if I understand this properly, with men expected to converse one way and women another. Young people generally are muddying the waters here, and this gendered speech is slowly fading out as a thing, but it does still exist. I'm very curious as to whether this kind of phenomenon shows up in other technically genderless languages. I only found it for this one. In general, again, this topic is really hard to research with non-European languages, and it was annoying because I want to learn more about that. Then our last category is the Niger-Congo language family, which includes Igbo and Swahili. The general understanding I was able to find here is that all pronouns are gender neutral, but you can specify gender within the nouns being used. All these languages have a lot of noun classes, much like we see with Russian. I was not able to find more about this language family in regards to gender because in general it's hard to find information about this language family. It is the reason I stopped learning Swahili very quickly after I started years ago. But anyway, that's it. That's all the information I found on this topic. It's definitely not exhaustive, definitely missing stuff, maybe got things wrong because it felt like some things I read were like, oh, this is really common, but then people who spoke the language had never heard of them, and it was just a lot. But in general, it seems like every language is doing some form of creating new words and repurposing old ones in various little community pockets, primarily pockets of young folks and in online spaces that aren't super widespread yet, but looking at other languages like Spanish and English as examples will likely become more widespread in the next decade or so. Even as people get angry about it, say it's westernizing or anglicizing their culture or whatever, things are still slowly changing and are going to continue to change because trans people exist in every culture and have existed in every culture. Like, you can find some non-gendered being in almost every single cultural folktale. It's not like we're a recent creation. And not only do these changes better include queer and trans people, but they also help with overall gender equality, which is really cool. I didn't even think about. And I'm really excited to see where this goes because I very much anticipate looking back at this video in 5 years and having it be completely outdated. And I think that's so freaking cool. So anyway, thank you for coming with me on this nerdy little journey. If I did not mention your language, please tell me about it in the comments. Also, if I did mention your language, tell me about your lived experience with it. Let us all be nerds together. And I'm rambling. Let's end this. As always, thank you for listening. Thank you for letting your members never to start over, and I look forward to seeing you, my dear, in the next one.